Greetings, dear listeners. This is Jonah Goldberg, host of the Remnant Podcast, brought to you by the Dispatch and Dispatch Media. We have a fantastic guest today who has written a fascinating new book, which I've confessed to her, and I will confess to you. I've only really just started digging into, but I'm very into it. It covers a lot of the themes that we talk about on here. Molly Worthen is a professor of history at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. And her new book is Spellbound, How Charisma Shaped American History from the Puritans to Donald Trump. Molly, welcome to the Remnant.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, so the rule here is when someone comes out with a book, I ask the question I always want to get asked when I'm on a book tour, which is simply, what's your book about?
My book is about how we make sense of the current political moment in the context of the longue durée of American history. And it's about where the abiding human impulse to connect our puny mortal suffering and chaos to a big transcendent narrative goes as a culture secularizes and people are less frequently going to traditional houses of worship. And it's about how perhaps there's not as hard and fast a line between religion and political spheres as we sometimes think.
All right, so we should, since it's sort of at the center of your argument, we should probably take a minute and do the terminology here. Charisma. I know charisma because I've read a good deal of Weber, and I know it means more than just being charming. But you go back to the original meaning of the word. So what is charisma? Why is it more than just being charming?
Yes. Well, the book is about charisma in both the original theological sense of the term, as well as the sense in which we use it in more colloquial speech when we're talking about a compelling leader in religion or politics or some other sphere. And I think the two have always been intertwined, the two senses of charisma. It comes from the ancient Greek word charis, meaning divine anointing, chosenness by the gods, which in that ancient context meant, receiving gifts, blessings that could redound to your benefit or backfire on you. And then in the New Testament, St. Paul takes that ancient idea and he turns it into charisma, which means a range of things in different contexts. Sometimes he uses the word to mean the free gift of salvation that God gives to all believing Christians. In other cases, he uses it to describe specific spiritual gifts, supernatural, crazy stuff, prophecy, the gift of healing, speaking in tongues, this kind of thing. And the term stayed kind of cordoned off in the world of Bible nerds and, theology classes for 1900 years until, as you alluded to, the German sociologist Max Weber borrowed the term in the first decade of the 20th century. And I think he tried to kind of broaden it and reinvent it in a way that would make his colleagues in the new emerging disciplines of the secular social sciences less squeamish about using a term that was still kind of fundamentally theological. So he sort of broadens it to describe a kind of authority that is distinct from authority that comes from a leader's role in an institution or via tradition or through having military might, but is rather a relationship between leaders and followers premised on the follower's conviction that the leader has a set of supernatural gifts or achievements. So, he doesn't really untether it entirely from that religious context. And from there, I think it has found its way into our popular speech and ended up in kind of a muddle. I mean, part of why I took on this project is because I just wanted an occasion to get clear in my own mind what this thing is. I think charisma is often a term that we punt to when we are observing a dynamic between a leader and followers, and we really don't get it. We don't see what people are getting out of this person, and there's not like an obvious sort of quid pro quo happening. It's mystifying, and so we punt to this term. When I began the project, I definitely confused it with charm. I thought I would be writing about a lot of very charming people who had high emotional intelligence or really good at working the room. They'd probably all be really good looking and amazing public speakers. But what I found was that was true more in the breach than in the pattern of things. And the broader pattern was that charismatic figures are deeply polarizing. They
Mm-hmm.
tend to have people who find them incredibly compelling, and then just as many, probably more people who find them totally repulsive. And they don't evoke a lot of lukewarm reaction. And the heart of that, where I landed after sort of surveying 400 years or so of history, is that the heart of charisma is a particular kind of storytelling. It's a relationship premised on a leader's invitation to followers to come take on a set of roles in a big, grand narrative that make better sense of the followers' individual lives and struggles than the other stories on offer in the culture. And the charisma, while the storyteller is important, the locus of the charisma is really in the story itself, which helped me make sense of how charisma could travel, how people could join religious movements without ever necessarily personally encountering the leader.
Mm-hmm.
And then it becomes this really interesting way of tracking what I think are abiding human hungers and anxieties across time. Because as we move through American history, we see certain types of charismatic stories rise and fall in their cultural resonance. And I think that gives us a way to understand the dominant anxieties and desires of each era of American history.
So there's a lot in there, and we're going to get to America in a short while. But first of all, it's funny. There are a lot of words. The one that comes to mind for me that's very similar to charisma is genius. Genius originally was this idea that a spirit came and visited you and imbued you, was a muse that came and gave you this moment of clarity and creativity. And, and that was the way it was. Not until pretty much the post-Enlightenment period that genius was something endowed inside of you rather than something given to you or graced to you, for sort of like the way you're talking about with charisma in the ancient world. It seems to me, from your description of it, I mean, obviously this idea of having a story that can spread farther than interpersonal stuff, Jesus seems like a really good example of that, and the story of Jesus and all that. But getting closer to modernity, when you think about an institution, a non-institutional figure who causes people to have an internal transformation, because I think that's a really important part. When I talk about politics, I started calling Barack Obama a charismatic figure, because in my reading of Weber, part of being a charismatic figure is that followers project onto the figure what they want to see in them. And so you can have really diverse people with different views all getting what they want out of the figure. But in the sort of pre-modern period, when I was listening to you talk, one of the people who comes to mind is Joan of Arc, right? She was a non-institutional kind of figure who had this narrative that caused a whole movement, nation to rise up. Are there other figures that you would? I know you started 400 years ago, and I shouldn't criticize you for only going back 400 years, but are there other sort of figures that you can think of that sort of, first of all, am I right about Jesus and Joan of Arc, but like, are there other figures that you would put in that, Jan Hus maybe, or whoever? I mean, Martin Luther to a certain extent, although he's a little different.
Yeah, well, all these figures are prophetic figures, and there's an impulse there that carries over in I think a pretty definite way into the colonial period of American history, which I label kind of the era of the prophets.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's true that there's always this sort of dialectic and tension between charismatic figures and institutions. Although often they find a way to meld their charismatic authority with institutional authority. There's certainly not a hard line between the two. But I think generally speaking, in the medieval Catholic Church, prior to the Reformation, without like romanticizing the control, the monopoly on charisma that the Catholic Church had, I think in general, in Christendom, it was a pretty stable, workable economy of supernatural power, if you will. So certainly, you have these outstanding cases like Joan of Arc or Jan Hus that cause major problems for the hierarchy and need to be burned at the stake.
Right.
But generally, the Catholic Church for hundreds of years is pretty good at channeling the desire that shows up in some religious geniuses, really, to use your term, to do a sort of end run around the hierarchy and access divine authority in a more direct way. They channel that into, hey, found a new monastic order, or let's take this lady prophetess and wall her up and give her a father confessor, can sort of keep her on the straight and narrow and make sure that her revelations don't deviate too far from orthodoxy. Like that works pretty well. And on top of that, for the lay Catholic person, there are all these doors and windows through which you are permitted to contact the divine. To use Charles Taylor's term, there's like a porousness to experience that I think it helps to satisfy and direct the human urge for connection with a transcendent power. I do think that the American story and much of what makes the United States different and makes charismatic leaders particularly resonant in this culture really starts with the Reformation. And it starts with the destruction of the Catholic monopoly on charismatic power that comes to really reduce and make overly simple a complicated story, comes in the insight and the revolution introduced by Martin Luther, who was no populist, right? I mean, when German peasants took his critique of the church to imply that they could overthrow the social order, and they launched the Peasants' War in 1524. He writes a treatise called "Against the Thieving and Murderous Hordes of Peasants," saying you all drew worldly conclusions that I did not intend. And in many ways, he wanted to collaborate with existing institutions and reform them to better align with his understanding of the Bible and his idea of the change in relationship that happens between God and the saved Christian. But there is, in the kind of kernel of his theological revolution, justification by faith alone, in which God makes this capricious decision to change his view of the individual depraved worm with no regard to the good works done or not done by that depraved worm, and that everything hinges on your personal internal relationship that is really only accessible to you with God. There is this kernel of powerful individualism and a mandate to reach out and claim a connection with the transcendent that is, I think, revolutionary and finds over the centuries its outworking and its kind of most extreme metastasized form in American culture, which becomes, relative to peer cultures across the West, a relatively free religious marketplace that encourages what you could call sort of spiritual entrepreneurship, both in religion and in politics. So I think the story of charisma in America is in many ways a peculiarly Western post-Reformation story.
So I'm kind of curious. I'm a big believer in American exceptionalism. I have to say, rightly understood, right? It's going back to like the Werner Sombart, why is there no socialism in America thing, and the standard story that we get from Sombart through Marty Lipset and all these guys is that we didn't have socialism because we didn't have feudalism, and so we didn't have that kind of class consciousness that you had in Europe and the overhang of all of that. And so much of the sort of Marxist stuff is really sort of a reimagining of the sort of feudal class consciousness in different ways. But it seems to me, it just occurs to me listening to you talk about this, that you can make the argument that the Protestant nature of the American founding, predating the actual founding, right, going to the Puritan period that you start with, is another major source of American exceptionalism, sort of on a separate but important but dependent track to, the sort of more class focused stuff. Is that fair? Is that right? Is it
Oh,
wrong?
that is absolutely fair. And it's not just significant that it is such a disproportionately Protestant group of immigrants who constitute, the European founding period, but it is a group of immigrants that disproportionately include sort of dissenter type Protestants from the Reformed tradition. Not all from the Reformed tradition, but generally that sort of Puritan, if not literally severing themselves from the Church of England, because only a minority of them really did that, at least technically speaking. In practice, they do, right, and they
Right.
are motivated by this rejection of the particular relationship between church and state in 17th century Britain, and they have a vision of the relationship between religion and culture and spirituality that I think comes to have disproportionate influence on the American experiment. I think it is so significant that the United States is a revolutionary state.
Yeah.
And while there are these sort of there's this long free church genealogy to the discomfort with centralized authority and state power that long predates, as you say, the founding. The upshot, the sort of intellectual upshot of the Revolutionary War is that the United States lopped off a huge chunk of its Anglo-American political philosophy inheritance, which at the time constituted primarily the Tory part, the kind of the conservative, centralized power, elite authority, trust in centralized elite authority part of the British inheritance. But that is really the headwaters of a whole range of ways of thinking about the role of the state in people's lives, and you can see it as an important ancestor in Canada, in Britain, other Western countries, in their own forms of left-leaning democratic socialist big government visions. And so I think that we have been operating since the revolution with a quite attenuated, a shrunken spectrum of ways in which American political thinkers consider it viable to solve the problems of living together in community that has absolutely hampered the development of socialism in this country. I think there are other really important factors.
Sure.
I mean,
Yeah.
the presence of race-based chattel slavery and the way race in America has cut across potential class alliances is, I think, also of tremendous importance. But I'm a big believer in the intellectual genealogy of these problems.
Yeah. I mean, the listeners have heard me bring this up a billion times, but Seymour Martin Lipset had always had this great riff about how the greatest natural experiment in political science wasn't between West Germany and East Germany or North Korea versus South Korea.
Canada and the U.S.
Canada and the U.S., right? And it's like, he points out, in 1970, both countries told their populations, we're going to switch to the metric system. And the Canadians, which was the founding stock, was genetically, culturally, basically the same as the American, right? We were like 26 colonies in North America, and 13 broke off and 13 didn't. And the 13 that didn't were mostly loyalists and royalists. And so when, a couple hundred years later, they say we're switching the metric system, they say, okay, in Canada and America, you're like, what sorcery is this? We're not doing that. There's an orneriness Protestant in the most generic sense, right? The most sort of refusal to go along with established authority that is sort of much more central to the American self-conception than even in Canada.
Oh, absolutely. I'm a big believer in teaching my students Canadian history. And the pitch I make to them is I say, even if you are a proud American nationalist, you have zero interest in any other country. If you know a little bit about Canadian history and this other stream of our shared civilization, there are all kinds of things that you currently take for granted about the American story, then you will see how contingent they are. And
Yeah.
the presence of a separate French Catholic civilization, in the
Hmm.
heart of Canada, since the beginning of, certainly, well before the beginning of the British phase that results in the polity we know today is so important. I mean, the threat of civil war along lines very different than those we imagine down here, I think shaped a lot of the compromises and the need to rely on a larger state authority to kind of balance out power, that have helped deviate the Canadian course from our own.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, one of the examples I often give purely as a jokey illustration is, the New York City bagel completely dominates American conception of what a bagel is. But the Jews who went to Canada went there at the same time, and they just have a slightly different bagel. It's the Montreal bagel. It's a good bagel. It's more like a bialy in my opinion, but it's just slightly different. And it's one of those sort of like Ray Bradbury stories that you step on a butterfly and all of a sudden our names are all spelled differently. It's just slight deviation between two very similar cultures, and you get very different political self-conceptions. I beat up on Canada a lot, but Canada is actually is a fascinating sort of acid test about what it means to be an American in a lot of different sort of surprising ways.
That's right. I mean, I think my students take the American culture wars for granted, and the outsized role of conservative religion and the kind of impulse that you see play out in America of, you disagree about something, well, go break away and start your own church or found your own school.
Yeah.
And the presence of kind of left-wing social gospel Christian activists who are blending socialist ideas and some sort of version of theistic, Marxian influenced ideology with Christianity. I mean, down here they function in this sort of marginal prophetic role, right? Like you can see that influence in someone like Martin Luther King Jr., but he's not in the center of power. He's critiquing it from the margins. Whereas in Canada, it's a totally different story, in which there isn't the same like explosion of the fundamentalist movement. There's much more of an ameliorative absorption of the kind of intellectual and cultural challenges that modernity brings. And you have the social gospel showing up right in the heart of centralized political authority. I mean, the founder of Canadian Medicare, Tommy Douglas, is a Baptist pastor who, is Premier of Saskatchewan, pioneers Medicare there, and that becomes the national system. So it's a totally different story when it comes to religion and politics.
All right, so I do want to get back to charisma, and we want to help you move books here and all that. But just because I'm personally kind of fascinated with this stuff, I would push back on it slightly in the sense I'm sure you have a response to it. But insofar as in the progressive era, the social gospel stuff was pretty central in public policy planning and whatnot. Richard Eli, I never know how I'm supposed to pronounce his name. Walter Rauschenbusch. All these kinds of figures. Richard, like I think half of the Richard Eli.
I think it's Ely.
Is it Ely? It will.
At
not
least that's how you
head.
pronounce it in Britain. Maybe I'm just being too Anglophilic there.
He was the founder of the American Economic Association, and until recently, they still had a prize named after him, even though he was a pretty unsavory guy in a lot of different ways. And he was also a social gospel minister. Half the original founders of the American Economic Association were sort of social gospel types. And I think that's one of the things that modern day progressives forget about the progressive era, is how shot through it was with this sort of religious Christian reformer ethos that kind of gets sanitized and bureaucratized by the time you get to the New Deal. But Woodrow Wilson, he famously said to the YMCA back when the C in YMCA was a serious thing, the job of an educator is to make men as different from their parents as possible, and it was a very sort of Christian infused understanding of what that meant. And I just think that's sort of been airbrushed out of a lot of American history. So anyway, I just think I take your point
Yeah,
about Canada, but American history, there was a high watermark for a lot of that stuff.
yeah, that's really interesting. I think you're highlighting how it can be tempting to fall into a kind of teleological narrative of any national story
Hmm.
and say, okay, because of these sort of features early on, it had to unfold in this way. And there are these inflection points, these crossroads, where it's quite plausible to see major national institutions, features of national culture going in a very different direction, right? I mean, if the American Medical Association had not been so much better at lobbying against universal national health care in this country than the parallel doctors organization was in Canada, which
Hmm.
tried to
Yeah,
hold it
yeah.
off there and failed, would we have a much more universalized sort of socialistic safety net than Canada does? It's a fair question. It turns on the roles of individuals and relationships as well as broad cultural currents. But thinking about your description of the 1920s, I mean there is this way in which that sentiment in its most radical forms, the sort of truly kind of Christian socialist sentiment, which is a sentiment, of course, that predates Marx, right? I
For
mean, the
sure. Yeah.
earliest socialists are not, I think people make a mistake when they associate it automatically with atheism. Um, it features in kind of these elite organizations, and
Hmm.
certainly someone like Walter Rauschenbusch is the face of a fairly radical expression of the social gospel. But I mean, what he represents is pretty quickly marginalized in a lot of kind of mainstream, Protestant, and then Catholicism has its own story along these lines with
Yeah.
Catholic social teaching, but a very careful sort of modulation, I think, of that impulse comes from leaders who are really worried about the ebb and flow of kind of the Red Scare, the various chapters of that, and by the time you get to the New Deal and this impulse, as you say, it's been sort of technocratized,
Yeah.
but it's also threatening to actually make an impact on policy that affects a much larger swath of American, communities. I think there is a pretty significant pushback against it and effort to really demonize any kind of Christian flirtation with socialist ideas as really verging on communism. But I'm glad that you point us to these moments of contingency because they're really important
Yeah.
to remember.
My favorite quote from Rauschenbusch was, he says, let the god of lower food prices be God, or back will have to go to competitive capitalism, or something like that. All right, so back to charisma. So start wherever you want. The story of charisma in the United States. Where does it take us? What is its role in sort of the populism of the 19th century? However you want to tell the story.
Oh gosh, that's probably the most open-ended question I've ever gotten. So I'll just start rambling, and you can interrupt me when you want to flag
Fair enough.
something. But part of the luxury of being a historian, as opposed to these quantitative social scientists who are all caught up and worried about their methods and things, is my project with any book I'm writing is just it's an occasion to get to learn about interesting people and stories that I didn't know enough about before, and then that has a sort of dialectical relationship with the patterns that start to emerge to you as you're continuing your research that then suggests, okay, I need to be looking here and there and focusing on these kinds of people. So that's sort of a caveat. I start the book with the infamous Puritan heretic Anne Hutchinson, who in the
Mm-hmm.
1630s, she starts out as a reputable kind of part-time midwife who's helping families deal with the continuous nightmare of infant and mother mortality that is human existence prior to the 20th century, right? So in a sense, she's a person who's doing theology in the trenches, I think, and is really having to grapple with the ways in which the Christian message, as it's being preached from most pulpits in Massachusetts Bay, is leaving people without comfort, without really a sense of assurance, what the Puritans called assurance, that they are among the elect and have a place in God's grand story, no matter their suffering in this moment. And so she starts running these Bible studies. Well, they're really meetings meant to discuss the previous weekend's sermon. They sound innocent enough, but they begin growing. First it's just women, but women start bringing their husbands. Some of the most influential merchants of the colony start rolling in to listen. And word gets out that she is becoming more and more critical of most of the colony's ministers and saying that they preach a message contrary to what Protestants believe the Bible teaches. And they are saying that you can earn your salvation. There are things you can do to prepare for God's call of election should it come. And this message that a Christian can have a kind of direct line to the Holy Spirit. I mean, she has a very kind of respectable Puritan version of this. Like, don't imagine some sort of hand-waving Pentecostal tongue-speaking, woman in a trance, but rather, encounter your scripture and pray, and the Holy Spirit will tell you that you are assured. This is an incredibly radical message, especially coming from a woman at this time. And I think we see in this early 17th century context a sort of almost perfect overlap between charisma in the New Testament sense, in the sense of literally the power of the Holy Spirit fallen upon you, and charisma in the sense of inviting followers into a story that activates them. And at the height of her powers in, 1635 or thereabouts, she's got more than half the congregation of Boston aligned with her. But this sets the colony's disciplinary machinery in motion. And pretty rapidly, she's put on trial, both in a civil trial and by a church trial. And they accuse her and convict her of slandering the authorities, both the civil and ecclesiastical authorities. She ends up banished, and she's killed in an Indian attack a few years later. So there's a way in which we have here what becomes a pattern, I think, in many of these charismatic movements, which is if your way to judge success or failure is, the lifespan of the movement and the leader's ability to instantiate his or her, vision for what ought to change in a lasting way, it looks like this movement is a failure. And charismatic authority, it is the most ephemeral type of authority. If a leader doesn't manage to fuse it with institutional authority or, some other lasting means, then it will pretty much live or die with that individual. But I kind of think Anne Hutchinson has the last laugh, because if we look forward in American religious and cultural history, much of what she's articulating, this emphasis on the personal relationship with the divine, and let's listen to your minister, but really listen with your own ear, because God will talk to you directly. That is the marrow of American evangelicalism, and even broader than that, I think that's at the marrow of how Americans generally like to function along the spiritual smorgasbord that has become our choices of worldview and metaphysical preferences. So it's a story that starts, in that quite religious context that's really quite still very bound to old world traditions and structures and having to riff off of them. But then it's one that kind of quickly gets a lot messier. So we could talk about, female spiritualist trance speakers, or Joseph Smith, or Andrew Jackson and Napoleon, Huey Long. I took a long kind of rabbit trail when I got to the 1950s and 60s. I thought I would be writing entirely about John F. Kennedy, and I did. He's in there, but I actually ended up writing a lot more about Adlai Stevenson as a much more important part of the story. He maybe wins the prize for least likely character, and then on into the sort of increasingly eccentric and perhaps surprising religious and spiritual movements of the 70s and 80s and beyond, and how they intersect with the burgeoning world of leadership studies and the way people in the sphere of business are talking about charisma and trying to sort of reshape what it means to be a boss in the kind of post 60s world of pop psychology and therapeutic culture.
All right, so let's narrow it down because I gave you such an open-ended question. So one of the things that I find fascinating, I've written a lot about over the years, is because I agree with you that the veneer, the blood-brain barrier, as it were, between religion and politics is much thinner than a lot of people think. I mean, I know we have this idea of separating church and state, but the fact is that so Michael Burley, the historian, he's made these arguments that basically the wars of religion in Europe never really ended; they just changed form. Eric Vogelin, one of my favorite philosophers, part of his he backtracked on it a little later, but one of his most famous and controversial arguments was that Nazism was a political religion, and that in fact a lot of the sort of, whether Marxist or non-Marxist, sort of progressive political religions were basically a reimagining of, he has this great line where he says, for the Marxist, I'm going to butcher it, but it's something like, the steam engine replaces Christ the Redeemer as the, as the force of history. And you have, one of the, when finally it dawned on the Catholic Church to realize that this fascism stuff is going to be a problem, they accused it of the heretical crime of stateolatry, worshiping the state as if it were a religion. And I look around at a lot of our politics of the 19th century, but even more so of the moment, as Will Herber had that famous line where he says, "Man is homo religio. We just have this religious instinct." And if you don't give it a religious outlet, it doesn't go away. It's like, it's the desire for transcendence is innate in us. And if we can't find it through what I would argue are healthy institutional religious channels, we'll find it someplace else. It's sort of Chestertonian. Once you stop, when you stop believing in God, it's not that you don't believe in anything. It's not that you believe in nothing. It's that you'll believe in anything, right? And that there have been all of these political movements that I think can better be understood as quasi-religious or ersatz religious things that are movements that play on that part of our brain, and we may not even realize it.
I think that's exactly right. I also want to make clear that when I'm talking about charisma, I don't mean to imply that every charismatic relationship between a leader and follower is some sort of magical thinking and story of manipulation. I think that's a temptation, especially since I'm defining charisma as a kind of storytelling. It can sound like I'm saying charisma is based on making stuff up. And I don't want to suggest that. I think charisma in and of itself is morally neutral. We are, as humans, we are storytelling, story craving creatures. It's how we organize information about the world. So I think you have charismatic leaders whose story is fundamentally based on objectively true claims about reality. And perhaps they are providing new information, or more likely simply inviting followers into a new way of organizing that information and seeing their own role in it. And then you
Yeah.
absolutely do have charismatic leaders who are pulling back the veil on a pseudo reality. And I think that's a major difference and helps us determine whether a leader is an agent for, moral progress or not.
Yeah, I mean, the question of I mean, we probably disagree on various political definitions of progress, but that's fine. But it seems to me when you, in those terms, then William Jennings Bryan is sort of archetypal of this, right? He had this story that had absolutely true elements to it, right? It's an organization of facts that comes up with a new narrative. It doesn't necessarily mean it's right or wrong, but it's compelling. And so, like the Cross of Gold stuff is a way. I mean, when you say stories, I know what you mean, but I feel like the missing ingredient is that the stories are ways to give people a sense of meaning and belonging in something, to better understand their place in the universe, which can obviously have religious aspects to it, particularly for people who have in their sort of cultural DNA certain notions of predestination and all of those sorts of things. But those kinds of stories, it's fine to say, oh, it's a political story, but that doesn't mean it's being processed by our lizard brains as necessarily purely about tax revenues and allocation of resources. It's a bigger story about meaning and my place in some grander narrative.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I agree. I agree completely. I mean, in the case of William Jennings Bryan, I think, one can critique his, economic understanding and his case for free silver. But
Right.
really that's, when you think about how populists who found him compelling encountered his sweeping vision, that the economic piece and its perhaps tenuous relationship to material facts is part of a much grander story about secular modernity and the dehumanization of it. And this is something that I think gets lost in the popular narrative of his role at the end of his life in the Scopes trial. And
Mm-hmm.
He's seen as this struggling old man, who is called up on the stand at the trial of this biology teacher, John Scopes, who has deliberately incriminated himself, right, by teaching the chapter on evolution from the biology textbook against this law in Tennessee. And so it culminates in this trial. Clarence Darrow is the fiery lawyer for the defense, and he deposes Bryan on the stand toward the end of the trial. And it's seen, I think, in some quarters as this total embarrassment for the kind of the grand man of fundamentalist Christianity who.
That's mostly because of the movie, though, right? I mean,
Well, yeah, I think
Yeah.
so, and I think also just sort of an attenuated understanding of that. If you take Bryan's halting, responses to Darrow's interrogation out of context of kind of the broader the story of what Bryan had to say about evolution, I think you can misunderstand him, because really, I mean, his concern, most conservative Christians back then were not what we would call young earth creationists. So most
Right.
of them, and I'm pretty sure this includes Bryan, had a much more subtle understanding of the scriptural's relationship to evolution than we might think, and believed that each day in Genesis might indeed stand for some very long period of time. What Bryan was really focused on was the consequence of sort of destroying this basis for the dignity of the human being without
Right.
really having any alternative. And all of the kind of consequences of that for what could then be justified. I mean, he was much more worried about Herbert Spencer's kind of survival of the fittest and social Darwinianism than he was the actual relationship between science and the first chapters of Genesis. So my point is that that's a big transcendent story that I think resonated with many Americans' sense that they were being left behind by modernity, and that there was this kind of moral disconnect between the elites and what they felt to be true in their own communities, and that's what's so compelling. And if, okay, he wants me to come along and vote for free silver on the way to that, then I'll do so.
Yeah, and people forget that William Jennings Bryan basically had a stranglehold on the Democratic Party for, what, he was the nominee, 3 times in a row, and was a the people think he's the butt of jokes because of the Scopes trial, which, by the way, he won.
Technically, yeah.
He didn't personally win. His reputation was hurt by it, but they found the guy guilty of teaching evolution. And I know I told you before we started recording that rabbit holes are encouraged. I will spare you, because it's not fair to do to you, my riffs on how Herbert Spencer has been wronged by historians, and that the whole social Darwinism thing was, I think, badly muddled by Richard Hofstadter, and they got that part wrong. But I think, just sort of. So here's my thing. So listeners are waiting for me to tee off on populism, because I do not like populism, and I don't like it in this moment. I've been a lifelong conservative. I've been writing about how populism is bad back when I was in very good odor on the right. And then when Trump came along, everyone's like, why are you anti-populism? And I'm like, I've always been anti-populism. And one of the lines I often quote is from William Jennings Bryan, because part of my problem is I like arguments, right? I mean, that's what I do for a living. I can argue with anybody about anything. I'm not saying I'm polymathic in what I can argue about, but I'm just saying I can argue with people who I profoundly disagree with, so long as it's in good faith, right? As long as we are going to listen to each other and agree that facts matter, and be willing to concede points if we have the facts wrong, or our interpretation is wrong, or there are new facts that are more important than the ones that we thought were matter, all that kind of stuff. And my problem with populism is that it's inherently opposed to that. And that's where I agree with Hofstadter. Hofstadter, part of his argument was in The Paranoid Style, which I also think is a misunderstood essay, is that populism is inherently anti-intellectual. And I would argue partly because of this charismatic aspect to it. And so William Jennings Bryan, he's got this wonderful line where he says, the people of Nebraska are for free silver, therefore I am for free silver. I will look up the arguments later. And that, to me, in many ways, is the essence of populism: is that it is organized political passion. And one of the things I like about the constitutional structure is that it recognizes that political passion is inevitable in politics, and it creates systems. The whole Senate is the cooling saucer of the House, because the House is the one that's closest to the people and all that kind of stuff. I don't want to take passion necessarily out of politics, but I also don't want passion alone to be determinative of political outcomes, because large numbers of people can be wrong. And just because you have 1 million people who say 2 + 2 is 5 doesn't mean that we should reorient our public policy to reflect that part. And this is part of my problem with the Trump era, is that Trump is just simply wrong about a great number of things. Like who pays a tariff, for instance. And people take it personally, right? If I say he's wrong about something, or if I say he's a person of bad character because, of all of his infidelities and whatnot, it gets to this two-way street thing of charisma that you're talking about. They take it personally. They think I'm insulting them because I'm insulting their avatar. And I can't argue. There's just no room there for an argument if you're letting political passion and emotion trump claims of fact. And so that's sort of my problem with populism. And I don't think you can have populist political movements without charismatic leaders. And which is not to say that all charismatic leaders are bad. Martin Luther King wasn't a bad person. He did great and noble things. But it does point to the fact that if you're not willing to channel the power that comes with that charisma towards productive aims, with sort of righteousness on your side, if you're not right about the underlying cause, then charismatic populist politics can get you into an enormous amount of trouble.
I think that's right. I'm pondering your comment a few minutes ago that anti-intellectualism is inherent in populism, and I'm thinking about what to do with this potent dimension of kind of late 19th century populism, which is the focus on education and these kind of local this local commitment among these farmer communities to pretty systematic education of their members. It's kind of it grows in some sense out of the Lyceum movement, and this sense that information should be democratically available, and that farmers, if they simply have access to the latest thinking on economics and agriculture, they can solve so many of their own problems. But overall, so there's
that's a very interesting counterpoint to my thesis, and I take it well. I mean, it's a good point. But
overall, I agree with your assessment, and I think there's a way. So, kind of pondering the longue durée of American history that I've been thinking about from the perspective of charismatic leaders, there's a way in which the power that Trump has and the role he plays, and also I think Americans' susceptibility to a whole host of figures I call sort of guru figures in our own time, and there are echoes between our moment now and these previous eras. But at the same time, it seems like in prior eras, charismatic leaders functioned in a more balanced ecosystem. Certainly, their potential followers existed in a more balanced ecosystem where they were deriving identity and they were getting information from a wider range of institutional sources, communities. They had more contexts in which to sort of decide whether they found the story offered to them by the charismatic leader compelling. And I think there's a way in which now, we're in this time in which American confidence in institutions, right, across the board, right? I mean, from the federal government to mainstream media, higher ed, even the military has less trust from American citizens than it has in prior eras. There's this way in which the equilibrium is off. The institutions are so weak right now. They are less able to stand up with the appropriate checks and balances to the challenge of charismatic leaders, who are calling to kind of burn it all down. And meanwhile, Americans, while we think as we sit on our sofas, scrolling with our little glowing rectangles, we think we are these autonomous learners who can command any information we want, with a little bit of
doing our own
searching.
research.
Do your own research, right? I mean, it's a lie, right? I mean, actually, the algorithms keep us in these little boxes, and we have less ability than ever before to, challenge whatever narrative we're being fed and asked to join in. So, I mean, I share your concerns, and I think part of what you're diagnosing is that this particular weakness of institutions, which to me, when people use the term secularization, usually we confine our meaning to the sphere of organized religion. But really, secularization is, to me, just a sort of shorthand for the decline of individual involvement in and trust in institutions in general. It does not describe a diminution of spiritual needs. That, as you say, like that, those needs will find their satisfaction somewhere else if they don't find it in churches or temples.
So, I mean, I want to come back to that with the time we have remaining, because Weber also has this line about the disenchantment of the world, which is sort of, in a way, the secularization that you're talking about. But I want to drag you back to the Protestant Reformation for 2 seconds. I recently had a very friendly disagreement with another historian, Alan Gelzo, about ideas versus material forces. And it was a very awkward thing for me because I'm usually on team ideas, and he outflanked me. And we got into this little disagreement about the Protestant Reformation, and he didn't convince me I'm wrong. But I, talking about populism, I think that populism is historically deeply tied. There's a high correlation between technological changes in modes of communication and populism, right? So, like, they crushed Jan Hus, but Martin Luther, in part because of the printing press, his ideas they couldn't contain, and people think it was all these brilliant tracts. Some of it was brilliant tracts. A lot of it was cartoons, or illustrations, and because most people were illiterate, and they had a very profound effect. And you can do a tight history of mass communication innovations and rise of populist movements. The printing, I would say, starting with the printing press. I agree with you that Martin Luther was not quite the populist people want to claim he was. He was one of these guys. The revolution got ahead of him, but the introduction of the radio, Father Coughlin was. You don't have a Father Coughlin without the radio. You don't have. I would argue you don't have a lot. You don't have the Huey Long types, or at least you don't have the scale of the Huey Long without radio. Hitler used radio very effectively. Fortunately, FDR, and I got a lot of criticisms of FDR, but he also used radio to tamp down some of these countervailing forces. And then TV, I don't know that you get all of the protest stuff of the 1960s if it wasn't televised. And now social media, I agree with you, or I take it that I agree with you, that the decline in faith and trust in the institution predates the social media age, but the social media age really accelerates it. And it makes it almost impossible for gatekeepers to have the edit function of just simply to say, hey, you don't have your facts right. Work on this a little bit more. You can just spew this stuff straight out there. Do you have any, first of all, where do you come down on the technological aspect of all of this, but also, do you have any glimmers of hope that we will be able to adjust like we did? Eventually we adjusted to the existence of radio. We adjusted to the existence of TV. But the pace of innovation with the social media stuff seems like it's going to be a while before we get meaningful institutional gatekeeping back.
Mastery of whatever the current most powerful means of disseminating your message, I think, is a necessary but not sufficient condition of being an effective charismatic leader. I can't think of a case I wrote about in which that is not present. Mm-hmm. And part of what is so powerful about a given movement, whether it's Joseph Smith, the founder of the Mormon Church, sending out missionaries and copywriting and printing up as many copies of the Book of Mormon as he can, and sending them far and wide to Britain, actually, right? I mean, mm-hmm. So there's like thousands of converts in Britain who upend their lives, move across the Atlantic to this tiny town on the banks of the Mississippi, Nauvoo, Illinois, never having met this prophet, right? Yeah. So this was one of these moments in my research that helped me see that the locus of the charisma is not in the guy, even mm-hmm. though he's awfully important as a major player in the story he's offering. But the charisma is in the story, and the story needs technology to travel. On the other hand, I found myself wanting in this book to push against what I think is a tendency we have to really see a deep, unbridgeable chasm between our era and everything that came before, and to kind of blame the internet for everything, and see all humans who lived before that as in some fundamental way different. I think really there's more continuity than difference, certainly when it comes to like the fundamental human hungers and drivers of these charismatic relationships. In terms of prognostication, I mean, I'm a complete curmudgeon and pessimist. I guess I'm encouraged that when I ban all technology from the moment one crosses the threshold of my classroom, students are actually more and more appreciative of the rationale and the fruits of this. And I'm intrigued by the hints of religious renewal that we're seeing, especially among Gen Z and disproportionately among young men, although not entirely. These statistics that are coming out of the usual religion poll operators like Pew and Gallup that suggest that, number one, the proportion of Americans who totally have disaffiliated with organized religion and won't even claim it as a label, that number finally seems to have plateaued, but is in fact dropping among younger Americans. And we're seeing these sort of weird surges of conversion to highly, in many cases, highly hierarchical, but in all cases, deeply supernatural and weird and quote unquote pre-modern expressions of Christianity, into Eastern Orthodoxy, Catholicism. In the UK, more kind of charismatically inclined Anglican churches are seeing uptick in numbers, especially among young people. And I'm afraid to even have this thought because I'm such a dour Augustinian, and I'm not an optimist. But I do detect a kind of exhaustion among younger Westerners with this mythology they've been fed since the 1960s, which is the key to happiness is to divest yourself of all obligations and burdens to any institution or tradition, and to shed as many duties as you can, and to find the quiet flame that is your authentic self, right? This sacred term, authenticity, and then to cultivate that and quote unquote find your passion and do that. Go it alone. You can find your own meaning, make your own meaning. And in fact, this story, which tells us we can be our own messiahs, it has, I think, led to a great deal of false hopes and misery. And we're social creatures, right? I mean, I'm a big fan of modern liberalism. I'm not suggesting we go back to some sort of Catholic integralists fantasy of the Middle Ages. But at the same time, I think we're due for a course correction that re-engages with deep ties to institution and tradition, not in this sort of casual pick and choose from the buffet of political and spiritual options way that is the norm for so many Americans, but in a way that actually involves real sacrifice and submission. And I think it's really interesting that more and more younger Westerners are curious about that way of dealing with the human condition. And maybe that suggests we're turning a bit of a corner.
Yeah, I share with you because I completely agree with you about institutions. We talk about that a lot on here. I'm a big Yuval Levin fan about the role of institutions and giving yourself over to an institution, a good institution, right? Because there are bad institutions. If you join the mafia, it'll make you a worse person. But bending yourself to an institution is a non-zero sum benefit. You make the institution better and you make yourself better. You need the right to exit, right? For the most part. It's a little more complicated for the military, but even there you have the right to exit. You just have a higher penalty for doing it. And so I'm totally with you on that. What I worry about is, and I just don't know the data. I don't know enough about the ground truths of some of the religious awakening shoots that we're seeing around, which I would welcome if they're authentic and healthy. I think it would be good for the country and good for the people involved. What I don't know is how much of it is, we talked a bunch here about the sort of religionization of politics, but there's also the politicization of religion. And you get a lot, there's a lot of stuff out there about, um, you know, churches, specific denominations confusing the role of the, I mean, so, I'm going to forget his name. He used to be the head of the Baptist seminary.
Al Mohler?
Yeah, no, he's now the editor of World Magazine, I think. I apologize. He's a friend, and I'm brain fried. But he tells the story about how he's had parishioners come up to him, or our pastors have told him the story about how they'll say things like, you know, turn the other cheek, you know, the golden rule, do unto others as you would have them do unto you, all these sorts of things. And people will come up to him afterwards and say, you really shouldn't be bringing that woke stuff into church. And he's like, I was literally quoting Jesus. And that stuff I find very, very disturbing. You know, Julian Benda's Treason of the Intellectuals, which is kind of a wild ride and all that. But, you know, one of the things I took from that was, you can always identify essentially a political religion. You can a politicized religion or religionized politics when you hear people in the early 20th century saying things like, Jesus was the first X, first socialist, first eugenicist, first nationalist, all these sorts of things. And it's this attempt to yoke this transcendent concept to a political agenda that I think is one of the truly wonderful things about Christianity in my book, is that, you know, it's against immanentizing the eschaton, in the sense that it doesn't want, it reserves paradise for the hereafter, not the here and now. And those social gospelers from the early 20th century, they wanted to have a kingdom of heaven on earth. And that always strikes me as, or I shouldn't say always, often strikes me as an attempt to borrow on the cheap the authority of religion for a political agenda. And when you do that, it becomes very difficult to argue on strict public policy terms against it, because lurking in the background is this sort of religious homunculus, which is the real impulse. And in this populist moment, there's just a lot of evidence that there's a lot of politicized religion out there. And I hope that the Gen Zers who are returning to religion are returning to it for the religion and not for a doubling down of the politics.
Oh, I'm completely with you. I'm really worried about it. I do think that there's a large swath of American Christians for whom a story that is not Christianity has kind of devoured or infected the Christian story. And so much depends on individual mentorship, I think,
Yeah.
you know, for these young men who are, I think, pulled in the direction of a sort of really hate-filled, revenge-minded, you know, understanding of becoming Christian as a reclamation of worldly power.
Yeah.
And what I would say is actually the Christianity of Jesus. And we are at a sort of crossroads point where I don't think it's clear which way it's going to tip. I do think that the genius of Christianity is that it's a religion built on a set of interlocking paradoxes, and
Mm-hmm.
one of those paradoxes is the already not yet paradox. So while Jesus said that his kingdom is not of this world, it's also true that his resurrection is the sort of first fruits of the kingdom, and Christians are supposed to live in this way that recognizes that in some way that the kingdom is already breaking through. And I get frustrated with these survey instruments that pollsters create that try to capture quote unquote Christian nationalists, because so often the questions on them are things like, you know, do you believe in prophecy? Do you believe in God's providence? Do you believe that
Yeah.
that a person's religious beliefs should inform their political decisions? Any mainstream, remotely Orthodox Christian would tick all
Right.
of those boxes, yes. And that can
Right.
end up conveying this sense that there's like this monolithic, army, that is the language you sometimes see in the media, of millions of Christian nationalists. And my
Yeah.
instinct has always been, to really assert the complexity and infighting and internal diversity of this world, but that's not to minimize precisely the problem that you're describing.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. I mean, one of the problems with the survey research is evangelical has become a term for a certain kind of white conservative. And then you ask these self-described evangelicals, when was the last time you went to church? And it was a long time ago. So it's something else is going on there. And there was a great poll that came out a while back, asking people if they'd heard of Christian nationalism. And it turned out that like self-described sort of blue state liberals were very familiar with the term, and actual Christians were fairly unfamiliar with the term. And it gets at this. I mean, I'm not saying I think the Christian nationalism thing is a problem, but I think I agree with you entirely. It would be folly and unfair to describe anybody who believes that Jesus Christ is their personal savior, or believes in the Nicene Creed, or believes in Christianity, is therefore a Christian nationalist. And I think part of the problem is we have a lot of journalists who know nothing about religion, and they just think they're all these strange others. And they hear sincere Christians who may detest Donald Trump or vote Democrat or 1,000 other things, but they use language of Christianity as like, eek, a Christian nationalist. And that's going to create more Christian nationalists than anything else.
That's right. And the kind of complicated, moderate expression of this, the pastors who actually are trying to assert, their congregants' identity in Christ over any political identity, and are criticizing, both parties. They just don't make for the same kind of, juicy news headlines.
Yeah, exactly. The planes that land don't get a headline. All right. I could do this all day. This is fascinating stuff. I love this stuff. The book so far is really wonderful, and we should let listeners know one of the reasons we found each other is we're doing a thing together for Aspen next week, and maybe there'll be some stuff that comes out of that as well that people can pay attention to. But Molly Worthen, thank you so much for doing this.
Thanks for having me.